On Christmas morning, when the world slows down just enough to breathe, two strangers stood at the edge of a choice neither of them planned to make. One was rushing forward, the other was trying to disappear. Somewhere between carols playing faintly in the background and the smell of rice and roasting meat drifting through the air, their lives collided in a way that would ripple far beyond that single day. This wasn't a story about wealth or power, and it wasn't about fame or heroism in the way movies like to sell it. It was about a moment, small, human, fragile, where kindness had to compete with fear, exhaustion, and the quiet voice that tells you to look away. In a world trained to scroll past pain, these two strangers did the opposite. And on a day meant for giving, they gave something the world had almost forgotten how to recognize. The streets of Manila were unusually calm that morning. Christmas Day has a way of softening even the loudest cities, as if everyone collectively agrees to pause. Jeepneys moved slower, vendors smiled more easily, and families gathered around tables filled with food that took weeks to prepare and months to save for. For many Filipinos, Christmas isn't just a holiday. It's a season of endurance, sacrifice, and hope stretched thin across generations. But not everyone wakes up on Christmas with a table waiting. Not everyone has a family calling their name. And not everyone feels like celebrating. Beneath the lanterns and lights, there were people quietly carrying losses the decorations couldn't cover. It was on one of these streets, between celebration and silence, that the first stranger walked. His mind heavy, his steps uncertain, unaware that Christmas was about to ask something from him he wasn't sure he could give. He was an overseas worker home for the holidays, one of millions of Filipinos who leave their families behind to support them from afar. His hands bore the signs of years of labor, calloused, scarred, steady. Coming home was supposed to feel triumphant, but instead it felt complicated. He had brought gifts, envelopes, and smiles rehearsed for relatives who expected strength. What they didn't know was how tired he was, not just physically, but emotionally. Years of missed birthdays, lonely nights, and silent struggles had accumulated into something heavier than luggage. Christmas was meant to be a reward for surviving another year, yet he felt oddly empty walking those familiar streets. He told himself to get home quickly, to avoid thinking too much. He didn't know that just a few steps ahead, someone else was standing still, wrestling with a far more dangerous kind of exhaustion. The second stranger was younger, though life had aged him fast. He stood near a closed storefront, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. To passers-by, he was invisible, the kind of person cities learn to ignore. He hadn't planned to be there either. Christmas had arrived with reminders he couldn't escape, messages he didn't receive, doors that stayed closed, and a future that felt impossibly narrow. In a country known for close families and loud celebrations, being alone on Christmas carries a special kind of weight. It whispers lies, that you don't matter, that no one would notice if you disappeared. He wasn't asking for help. He wasn't calling out. He was simply waiting, hoping the noise of the world would drown out the thoughts he could no longer control. Their paths crossed in the most ordinary way. No dramatic music, no warning. Just a brief moment where one man noticed another standing too still for too long. The overseas worker slowed down, unsure why. He had passed hundreds of people like this before, in cities across the world, learning the skill of emotional self-preservation. But something felt different. Maybe it was the way the young man avoided eye contact. Maybe it was the way his shoulders sagged, as if gravity itself had given up on him. Or maybe it was simply Christmas, a day that strips excuses bare and asks uncomfortable questions. He hesitated, torn between the safety of walking away and the risk of getting involved. That hesitation, barely a second long, would become the most important pause of his life. The world teaches us that stopping is dangerous, that involvement invites trouble, that compassion should have boundaries. These lessons are especially familiar to people who have struggled, because they know how fragile stability can be. The overseas worker felt all of that in an instant. He thought about his family waiting at home, the food cooling on the table, the laughter he didn't want to miss. He thought about the stories he'd heard. Scams, confrontations, misunderstandings that spiral out of control. Yet he also thought about something else. How many times he himself had wished someone would notice when he was at his lowest. Christmas, he realized, wasn't asking him to save the world. It was asking him to see one person. And so, against instinct and fear, he turned back. "Okay, Ka Lang." The words came out gently, almost apologetically. "Are you okay?" The question hung in the air longer than expected. The young man looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten other people could hear him breathe. For a moment there was silence. Then his face cracked, not into tears but into something more dangerous. Honesty. He shook his head. No long explanation. No dramatic confession. Just a quiet, broken no. That single answer carried more weight than 1,000 words. It was an admission the world rarely makes space for. The overseas worker felt his chest tighten. He hadn't planned for this part. He hadn't prepared answers or solutions. All he had was presence. And sometimes, presence is the only thing that keeps someone from stepping over an invisible edge. They sat on the curb, two strangers united by a shared pause in the day. Traffic passed. Laughter echoed from nearby houses. Christmas songs played from a distant radio, their cheer almost ironic. The young man spoke slowly at first, as if testing whether his words were safe to release. He talked about pressure, financial, emotional, societal. About being told to be grateful while feeling empty. About feeling like a disappointment in a culture that values resilience and sacrifice. His story wasn't uniquely Filipino. It echoed in cities across the world, from London to New York, from Lagos to Berlin. The details changed, but the loneliness didn't. The overseas worker listened, not interrupting, not fixing. He realized something profound in that moment. The world doesn't lack advice. It lacks listeners. As the minutes passed, something subtle shifted. The young man's breathing steadied. His voice found rhythm. The simple act of being heard began to loosen the knot he'd carried alone. The overseas worker shared parts of his own story too. Not to compete, but to connect. He spoke of homesickness, of pretending to be strong, of crying silently in foreign rooms where no one knew his name. The distance between them shrank. Christmas lights flickered overhead, indifferent yet witness to something deeply human. This wasn't charity. It wasn't savior and saved. It was two people meeting at the same emotional altitude, realizing that survival often depends on moments like this, unscheduled, unpaid, unrecorded acts of care. When they finally stood up, the day felt different. Lighter but heavier in meaning. The young man didn't suddenly have answers, and the overseas worker didn't suddenly become a hero. What changed was simpler and far more powerful. One man no longer felt invisible, and the other no longer felt empty. They exchanged names, a number scribbled hastily on a scrap of paper, and an awkward smile that carried more sincerity than any wrapped gift. As they parted ways, Christmas continued around them. Meals served, photos taken, laughter shared. But something important had already happened. Quietly and without applause. Two strangers had made a choice to stop, to see, to care. And in doing so, they created a moment the world desperately needs to remember. Christmas night arrived quietly for both men, but neither experienced it the way they expected. The overseas worker sat at his family's table, surrounded by voices, food, and warmth, yet his mind kept drifting back to the curb where he had stopped earlier that day. While his relatives laughed and exchanged stories, he listened differently, noticing how easily people assume togetherness equals happiness. Across the city, the young man returned to a small room that felt less suffocating than it had that morning. The silence no longer screamed. It breathed. He replayed the conversation over and over, still surprised that someone had noticed him without being asked. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time in a long while, Christmas didn't feel like proof of what he lacked. It felt like a reminder that he still belonged somewhere in the human story. In the days that followed, life attempted to return to its usual pace. Traffic thickened. Offices reopened. Responsibilities reclaimed their grip. Yet both men carried the encounter with them, like a quiet echo that refused to fade. The overseas worker found himself more present with his family, less distracted by his phone, more attentive to the subtle emotions beneath casual conversations. He realized how often he had been physically present but emotionally distant, not just abroad but even at home. The young man, meanwhile, started responding to messages he had ignored for weeks. Not all of them, not perfectly, but enough to signal movement. Healing didn't arrive as a dramatic breakthrough. It came as permission to take one small step without shame. The world likes to celebrate transformation, but rarely respects how fragile the beginning of change really is. They kept in touch, exchanging short messages that carried more meaning than long conversations ever could. No pressure, no expectations, just check-ins that said, "I remember you exist." For the overseas worker, this connection became a mirror, proof that even in his exhaustion, he still had something valuable to offer simply by being human. For the young man, those messages became anchors on difficult days, reminders that isolation wasn't absolute. Their relationship didn't fit a label. They weren't family, co-workers, or close friends. They were something rarer in modern life. Two people who chose continued care without obligation. In a world that monetizes attention and schedules empathy, this kind of connection feels almost radical. What made their story powerful wasn't its uniqueness. It was how common it could have been. Every city has a curb like that one. Every Christmas, millions of people feel unseen while surrounded by celebration. Social media floods timelines with perfection, making quiet suffering feel like personal failure. In Filipino culture, resilience is often praised, but vulnerability can be misunderstood as weakness. The young man had absorbed that lesson deeply, believing his pain disqualified him from joy. The overseas worker had learned a different version of the same lesson: endure silently, provide consistently, and never complain. Their meeting disrupted both narratives. It suggested that strength doesn't always look like endurance. Sometimes it looks like stopping long enough to admit you're tired. As weeks passed, the young man began making changes that seemed small to outsiders but felt monumental to him. He sought help, not dramatically, not publicly, but honestly. He spoke to a counselor at a local community center, one he'd walked past dozens of times without entering. He reconnected with a relative he'd distanced himself from out of shame. Each step felt uncertain, but none of them felt as terrifying as standing alone on Christmas morning had. The overseas worker watched this from a distance, careful not to interfere, understanding that support doesn't mean control. He learned that the most respectful way to help someone heal is to trust their pace. This lesson followed him back overseas when it was time to leave again. Returning abroad felt different this time. The airport still smelled the same, the goodbyes still hurt, but something inside the overseas worker had recalibrated. He noticed people more: co-workers who lingered after shifts, strangers who seemed weighed down by invisible burdens. He couldn't stop for everyone, and he knew that now. But he also knew that stopping for one person had mattered more than he'd ever imagined. Christmas had taught him something no training or experience ever had. That impact isn't measured by scale, but by sincerity. In a global workforce built on efficiency, this realization felt quietly revolutionary. Months later, when another Christmas season approached, the young man found himself standing in a different place. Not just physically, but emotionally. Life wasn't perfect. Some days were still heavy, but he no longer believed his presence in the world was accidental. He volunteered at a community kitchen during the holidays, not out of obligation but out of understanding. He saw himself in the faces of people lining up, not broken, just tired. He didn't offer speeches or advice. He offered food, eye contact, and time. Without realizing it, he was passing forward the same choice that had once been made for him. The overseas worker watched this unfold through photos and brief updates sent across time zones. He felt a quiet pride, not ownership. This wasn't his success to claim. It was a shared moment that had grown roots. He reflected on how often people underestimate the power of ordinary days. Christmas had simply provided the contrast, light against darkness, but the choice itself was available any day of the year. The world didn't need more perfect people. It needed more willing ones. People willing to pause, to listen, to risk being uncomfortable for the sake of connection. Their story never went viral. No headlines were written. No cameras captured the moment on the curb. And yet, its impact traveled farther than either of them could see. It lived in the young man's decision to stay, in the overseas worker's renewed sense of purpose, in every quiet interaction that followed. This is how change often moves through the world, not loudly but persistently, not as spectacle but as choice, the kind of choice anyone, anywhere can make. The kind that doesn't require resources, only awareness. Christmas, in the end, wasn't the miracle. The miracle was two people choosing humanity over indifference, choosing to see instead of scroll past, choosing to ask a question and wait for the answer. In a divided, distracted world, that choice remains available to all of us. Every day offers a curb where someone stands unseen. Every season offers a pause where we can decide who we want to be. On one Christmas in the Philippines, two strangers made a choice that didn't just change their lives. It quietly reminded the world of what it means to belong to one another. As another year turned, the memory of that Christmas remained vivid, not as a dramatic rescue, but as a reference point. Whenever life grew heavy, both men returned to that moment in their minds, not to relive pain, but to remember possibility. The young man learned that despair often lies to us about permanence. What feels endless is usually temporary, even if it doesn't feel that way while we're inside it. The overseas worker learned something just as important. That purpose doesn't always come from achievement. Sometimes it comes from alignment, from acting in a way that reflects the person you hope to be. These realizations didn't erase hardship, but they softened it. And in a world that moves too fast to pause for reflection, softness became its own quiet strength. Across the globe, Christmas looks different in every country. Snow in some places, heat in others. Silence in some homes, chaos in others. Yet the emotional landscape remains strikingly similar. Loneliness doesn't care about geography. Neither does kindness. What happened on a street in the Philippines could just as easily have happened in New York, London, Lagos, or Berlin. Two strangers. One moment. One decision. The universality of that choice is what gives it weight. It reminds us that humanity isn't divided by borders as much as we pretend. The same fears, hopes, and longings exist everywhere, often hidden behind different languages and customs. And Christmas, for all its differences, has a way of exposing those truths more clearly than any other day. In Filipino culture, the phrase kapwa speaks to shared identity, to seeing the self in the other. It's a concept that doesn't translate cleanly into many languages, but its meaning is felt instinctively. That Christmas moment was an expression of kapwa in its purest form. Not charity from above, not obligation but recognition. The overseas worker didn't see a problem to solve. He saw himself in another human being. The young man didn't see a stranger. He saw proof that his existence mattered. In a modern world obsessed with individual success, this idea feels almost countercultural. Yet it's exactly the value that has sustained communities through hardship, migration, and loss for generations. Years from now, neither man may remember every word spoken that day. Memory is selective and time blurs details. But they will remember the feeling of being noticed, the feeling of choosing to stay. These emotional imprints last longer than facts. They shape how people respond to future moments of crisis, both in themselves and in others. The young man may never again stand on a curb wondering if he should disappear, but he will recognize that look in someone else's eyes. And when he does, he'll know what to do. Not because he was taught, but because he once received it. The overseas worker, now older and still working far from home, carries that Christmas like a compass. When work feels endless and recognition scarce, he remembers that his value isn't confined to remittances or productivity. He remembers that being present, truly present, can be enough. In foreign cities where loneliness hides behind busyness, he has learned to slow down just enough to notice. He can't change systems or solve structural problems alone, but he can still choose how he moves through the world. That choice, repeated quietly, has become his own form of resistance against a culture that treats empathy as expendable. This story doesn't ask us to be extraordinary. It asks us to be available. Available to the discomfort of someone else's pain. Available to the possibility that our smallest actions might matter more than we think. The world often convinces us that unless we can do something big, we shouldn't do anything at all. But change rarely announces itself with grandeur. More often, it arrives disguised as inconvenience. Delayed walk home. An unanswered message finally returned. A simple question asked without certainty of the answer. These are the moments that shape lives quietly, invisibly, and permanently. If there is a message hidden in this Christmas story, it isn't wrapped in moral instruction. It's wrapped in invitation. An invitation to look again at the people we pass every day. To question our assumptions about strength and success. To understand that joy and pain are not opposites. They often exist side by side. Especially during the holidays, when expectations run high and patience runs thin, this understanding becomes vital. The season doesn't magically heal wounds. People do. And they do it not through perfection but through presence. Somewhere right now, someone is standing still in the middle of a moving world. They may not be asking for help. They may not even know how. And somewhere else, someone is rushing past, convinced they have nothing left to give. What happened one Christmas in the Philippines suggests that both of them might be wrong. That what one lacks, the other carries without realizing it. And that when those two truths meet, something quietly powerful can happen. The world doesn't need more stories of spectacle. It needs stories of choice. Of ordinary people deciding, in unscripted moments, to act with care. These are the stories that restore faith without demanding belief. That unite without erasing difference. That remind us that humanity is not lost. It's just often exhausted. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stop long enough to let another breathe. On Christmas, two strangers made a choice. Not one that changed headlines or history books, but one that changed how they moved forward in the world. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the world doesn't change all at once, but moment by moment, choice by choice, person by person. In a season filled with noise, their quiet decision still echoes. Waiting patiently for someone else to make it again. Thanks for watching.